So can you hear me, Nadine? Can everyone hear me, Yvette?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay,
we can.
perfect. Do we have, should we get started now, Nadine?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Great. I know we do not want to miss any of this session because we want to just hear you. We're very excited. Well, good morning or afternoon, everybody. And to start, happy National Disability Employment Awareness Month. My name is Gail Weidman, and I am the chair of the Arizona ILG. I'm joined by Alicia Turner-Robertson, who is the chair of the St. Louis ILG. The Arizona ILG and the St. Louis ILG, the Arizona ILG and the St. Louis ILG have partnered with several ILGs across the U.S. You can see here the list of all of the ILGs who are participating in this event. We all collaborated to bring you this very special live stream event. First, for those who are on the call that are not familiar with the ILGs, I'd like to clarify the purpose of what an ILG is. So ILGs are industry liaison groups. And what we do is we provide opportunities for the U.S. government contractors, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, also known as the OFCCP, and the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, known as EEOC, to interact in a non-adversarial environment, promote and support non-discrimination, as well as equal access and opportunity in the U.S. workplace. Now, ILGs, industry liaison groups, also provide the human resources professional or employment law advisory, a means of expanding their knowledge and expertise in this very complicated but critical business function. Participation in the ILG process requires a belief in non-discrimination and equal access opportunity, and a commitment to finding mutually effective and beneficial compliance solutions. Now, to determine if you're an invited guest who is not part of a local ILG, I highly recommend that you visit the National ILG website, which has a listing of all of the regional ILG chairs. And I just welcome you to reach out to any of the chairs to get more involved with your local ILG. And that would be the NILG.org website. That's the National Industry Liaison Group website. So before I get started, before we introduce our speaker, I just want to do some quick housekeeping tips. All attendees are muted upon entry. If you have any questions for Nadine, please submit your questions via the chat feature, or you can submit them via the Q&A feature. Myself, as well as Alicia, we will be monitoring both of these features, and we will ask the question on your behalf. Some of you have asked about the presentation and/or recording. We are recording this session. We are recording this session, and within a week or two, we'll make the recording available to your local ILG. Now, for HRCI and SHRM recertification credits, this event has been approved for 2 general credits for HRCI and 2 credits for SHRM, SHRM. We will try to provide those program numbers through the chat function, but at the end of this session, we're also going to be putting up a slide that will have the program numbers visible to you. Also, after the session, Yvette will be sending out an email which would have the certificate attached. So you'll have that so that you could apply for your recertification credits. Now I'd like to ask Alicia to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Gail. Good morning or good afternoon to our audience. Nadine Vogel is the CEO of Springboard Consulting, LLC, a global company working with national and multinational corporations around the world to successfully mainstream disability in the global workforce, workplace, and marketplace. Springboard Consulting produces the world-renowned Disability Matters Conference and Awards Gala. Nadine serves as founder and CEO of the Springboard Foundation, which provides scholarships to college students with disabilities. In addition, Nadine is a CEO of Disability Mama and Company, celebrating, empowering, and educating women around the world who have children with special needs. And prior to founding Springboard, Nadine held a variety of executive positions in both corporate America and the nonprofit sectors. Nadine is also an author of a book titled Dive In. It's a highly acclaimed must-read business book. She is a regular contributor to several well-known diversity magazines, such as Diversity MBA Magazine and Diversity Executive Magazine, just to name a few. She is recognized as a powerful, motivational, informational, and inspirational speaker. Nadine has also received numerous awards and accolades that are listed in her bio. She has been featured on NBC News as well as other media news networks. And without further ado, it is my pleasure to say, join me in welcoming Nadine Vogel.
Thank you. Oh my gosh, just hearing that's going to give me a big head. So the other thing it does is it puts a lot of pressure on me to say really good stuff today and give good information. But I promise to do that for all of you. And as Gail said, please pose questions. We're not going to hold up questions to the end. So as issues come up, questions, comments, cases maybe that you want to discuss, just bring them up and we will address them throughout. So this session, we're going to focus on disability disclosure, self-ID, and the impact of culture. And this is really important because when we talk about culture, certainly there's geographical culture, but there's also this company culture, organizational culture. And what we don't realize so often is that no matter how hard you all are working to get done what you need to get done, especially from a compliance standpoint, the culture sometimes upends your plans. And so what I thought we would do today is go into more of a practical perspective in terms of what is it we're really talking about when we talk about the topics. So we'll go to the first slide on disclosure. Let's just start with that. So some of this, obviously, you all know, right? Disclosure is a personal decision. We have found often that in some organizations, if someone discloses, let's say they've been with the organization for 2 or 3 years, and they disclose, and they say, well, I've been dealing with X. Sometimes the manager's response is very negative. Well, why have you been hiding this from me? And so the approach and the way they respond to that individual is not always appropriate to understand that it's not only a personal decision, it's a really tough one. I have 2 adult daughters with disabilities, and I know what their own struggles have been relative to disclosing the disability in a variety of situations. So it's not someone's intentionally trying to hide it. Maybe they didn't feel they were ready for it. Maybe they didn't feel they needed an accommodation, so they didn't want to talk about it. So that's one piece of culture in that we have to help managers understand that it is very personal, and the personal affects the timing. Number 2, it is not a legal requirement. Managers, again, depending on the organization, have said to me, well, that person has to. They have to disclose. Well, that's not true. Now, if the individual is asking for a reasonable accommodation, or in the UK, a reasonable adjustment, then yes, they can't just say, I want this. There has to be some opportunity to discuss what's behind it, and that's where the disclosure would come in. But although you all obviously understand this better than anyone, from a corporate culture standpoint, what we found is that information doesn't always cascade appropriately down to the management level. And it causes them, again, to react and respond inappropriately. Now, there's this issue of when is the appropriate time? It kind of goes back to what we started about it being a personal decision. But I will share with you for the next 3 pieces about when is appropriate time, who to disclose to, and how. You might find this very interesting. We at Springboard did some research, and we talked to folks who are employees with different disability types, different functions in the organization, different industries. We even actually extended this to different countries and geographic cultures. And we asked what their issue was relative to disclosure. And it's very interesting. We said, if you were to disclose, when would you do it? And the number, we got a lot of answers, obviously, but the most common answer that we got is that the individual would disclose at performance review. I'm sure you're all thinking, really? That is the worst time for someone to disclose, especially if you're in a situation where perhaps the manager is going to say, you know, we need to talk about some performance issues you've had, and then the individual responds by saying, well, look, I have a disability and, right? Now it immediately puts up this adversarial wall of, well, why didn't you tell me that before? Why are you telling me that now? What were you trying to hide? So we have to remember that that's not at all the right time to do that. Who to disclose to? We asked again, if you were to disclose, who would you go to? That was a real challenge for most folks because many were not comfortable going to HR, or if they were not comfortable going to their manager. What we heard very often is that they would go to a colleague, a friend who maybe worked in HR or worked in one of these organizations, but was not in their pipeline of management because that's where they felt comfortable. And that's a real issue because then are you putting the company on notice through your friend? What is that friend's obligation at that point now that they're aware? Was it an off-the-record conversation? Not. When you're in that corporate environment or educational institution or any workplace, that becomes a real challenge. So that was another piece. Now, going into how, before we even did that, we said, so if you were to go talk to your friend or manager or whomever, where would you disclose? And the number one answer we got was someplace that was very open, public, a company cafeteria, someplace where a lot of people were around, and we were surprised by that. And we asked, well, why? And the response was primarily because we're concerned about how that manager is going to respond. I'm afraid to just be alone in the room with that person. I want to know there's other people around, not so much to hear my personal information, but to just give me comfort that there's other people around. So that was also interesting. And then we said, well, how would you go about doing this? And, you know, in my mind and in our experience, it would be that the person, when they've decided this was an appropriate time, would go to their manager and request an appointment to sit down and have a discussion. That doesn't seem to be how they were doing it. They felt like they were going to get it, that their manager would somehow find out through this friend or whatever, and then the manager would perhaps approach them. Or they would go to HR, HR would talk to the manager, and the manager would come to them. So there's really a disconnect with what disclosure really means, when and how to do it. You know, we think people don't disclose because of how they'll be treated, how they believe they'll be treated after they do so. That is a component of it. But the number one reason we got when we asked, well, at the end of the day, really, why don't people disclose? It was the last circle on this screen. It was the how. They felt that if they did it wrong, we'll put that in quotes, that in essence is what would cause them to be treated inappropriately later, that something would come down the pike to hurt them. So we spend a lot of time training managers how to respond if someone discloses. What we have found is most organizations, companies, educational institutions do not necessarily spend the time coaching individuals with disabilities on how to disclose and all the components that we just talked about. And so it's a mixed bag because the manager is waiting to hear certain words, maybe see certain actions. The individual with the disability is not necessarily following that, and we have the disconnect. By the way, also when we asked about the concern relative to how managers would respond, so some of the things we heard, two in particular that stand out for me, is one manager responded and said, that I really appreciate you sharing. You may not know this, but I had a sister with the same disability, but she died. Well, that's not very helpful. And then another one that stood out for me was, again, kind of same thing. Thank you for sharing this. I would never have guessed you seem so normal, or you look so normal. That is even more distressing. But I will say that when we've done scenarios and role plays with managers, we have heard some of those same responses. So something to keep in mind here is that we have to think about, it's a two-part process. We have to think about how we speak about disclosure to management in terms of how to respond in the personal nature and things like that. And at the same time, we really have to train and work with individuals with disabilities on how to look at it on a bigger, broader scale and how to get comfortable with doing it. So when we look at the next piece, next slide, what we really want to talk about here is, again, the reasons why individuals don't disclose. So let's just walk through this because I want to make sure that this is clear. How they'll be treated, assumptions made about the impact of their disability on their performance and therefore treated differently. Another thing that came up was that we had a lot of folks say that once they disclosed, anytime they were out of the office, it seemed like management assumed it had to do with the disability as opposed to they were going on vacation with their family or they were doing something that anybody else would do. Another thing that we also heard is that, out of concern, that it would impact their ability to be considered for other roles that may require travel, relocation. And by the way, we've heard this from managers. I don't think Nadine would be good for this job because, you know, it does require a lot of air travel. It requires a lot of client contact. You know, they'd have to relocate. I know they have children with disabilities. So there's a lot of assumptions made once this individual has disclosed about will they be good in a certain role, should they be considered or not. So a lot of these concerns that individuals with disabilities have is true. But at the end of the day, I go back to the number one reason, which was I don't know how. So let me just stop there for a second and just see if there are any questions or comments on that. Anybody? Okay. So let's go on then to the next slide, disclosure and organizational culture. What I want you all to think about is in your own organizations, think about what you are putting out there. What is being said about disclosure? I know what the intent is, but what we have to talk about is what is actually being said about it. Is there a process? Is there a communicated process? What is being offered? So I'm going to give you an example. There's something called a disability disclosure guidance tool. Now, we just talked about how individuals with disabilities are a little challenged with how to do this and how to feel comfortable doing this. Are we actually offering them guidance to help them make that decision? So a disability disclosure guidance tool, Springboard has created them. You can create your own. You put it on your intranet site. This has become a global best practice, so this is not just U.S. And what happens is a series of questions that someone will go in with a disability and ask themselves, you know, why am I going to disclose? What are some of the issues? And we're going to walk through this in more detail, but the idea being, let's say there's a question on there that says, and this is going to relate to culture. I believe my company trains managers on how to work through disability situations. Yes, no. And let's say the person clicks on no. They don't believe that. But you actually do provide training and guidance. If they click no, a pop-up would come up and say, you may want to look at, or did you know? And it allows you to reinforce that your company culture is such that you are doing this. They may not be aware of it, but you are providing training or guidance. That's really important. I believe my organization has a reasonable accommodations process. Yes, no. No. Something would pop up and it would speak up. Yes.
I am so sorry. This is Gail. I don't mean to interrupt you. I was trying to get off of mute and it wasn't working, so I apologize. I actually have two questions for you, but before that, I'm getting something through chat about your mic. It might be too close for getting a distracting like noise from, maybe your mic is too close to you. Is there a way to fix that? Or
we could try that. Is that better?
Okay.
Hopefully.
Yeah, there was just some reverberation. I just didn't want to stop you because you were on.
Okay, well let me also adjust volume a little bit and we'll see if that helps.
Okay, perfect. And did you want me to ask these two questions now?
Yeah, sure, go ahead, and then I can come back to this.
Perfect. Okay, so the first question is, going back to the personal decision on disclosing, the disability spectrum is wide. Do we need to disclose even if we do not need a reasonable accommodation or impact our work?
I am so glad. So whoever asked that question, thank you. I am so glad you did. So the answer is it depends, because when we spoke with individuals with disabilities about disclosure, we had some say, look, I don't need a reasonable accommodation. My disability is invisible, but I'm going to disclose because I want to be able to bring my whole self to work. Otherwise, I feel like I'm always hiding something about myself, and that's not who I am. I don't want to hide. So they would do it. My older daughter has facial deformities as a result of her disability. She requires no accommodations. But if she doesn't have a disclosure conversation of sorts, assumptions are made about her ability and what she can and can't do. So at the end of the day, it still very much becomes a personal decision. There's a woman at a big accounting firm who has MS. And when she was diagnosed, there were no visible signs whatsoever, and she decided not to disclose initially. And then as she felt that every so often something was happening to her body, and, you know, one day she couldn't get up as early, she said, I feel like I need to disclose because I don't know what tomorrow's going to bring, and I don't want someone to feel like I was holding back. So again, it becomes so personal. Here's the challenge. There are assumptions being made, and we're going to talk about this even later, but there are assumptions being made about disability. You hear a lot about unconscious bias. In the disability space, I think in many spaces, bias is conscious. It doesn't mean we're trying to be mean. It means based on what we were brought up with and our experiences, the assumptions we make. So the challenge is, depending on the nature of someone's disclosure and the nature of their disability, the concern is now, what is someone going to think about me or my performance? So it still is very personal, and that's what we have to remind managers within organizations. So thank you for that question. Yeah, I think there was another one.
Yes, I have another one, and I believe Alicia, I see two here, and then I believe
Alicia
good. Has one too. Yay! So it's an active group, which is wonderful. Okay, so here's another question. So if you have an employee who is requesting accommodations but has never disclosed, can you alter their HR record as identifying as disabled once you provide the appropriate accommodations?
Yes. So remember, once someone makes a reasonable accommodation request, and actually in the next piece we're going to talk about process, and that might answer some of this as well. But once someone makes that accommodations request, and you go into the interactive dialogue, there's going to be documentation. I'm asking this because once that happens, then yes, that is disclosure, and the HR records can absolutely be updated at that point.
Okay. I see another one come in, and Alicia, then I'm going to pass it over to you because I know you had more questions. So this one just came in too. Is the company liable if they are aware of a disclosed disability, but the employee has not requested an accommodation and is performing badly and attributes it to their disability?
Oh, you guys are good. You guys are so good. You don't need me. So here's what's really interesting about that, right? We've had, and this goes back to company culture again, but we've had companies say, you know, I think this person just put us on notice. You know, what are we going to be liable for? Because they told us they have a disability, but they don't seem to need anything. They're not asking for an accommodation, but we're having performance issues. So what I want everyone to remember, and we have to train managers on this, at the end of the day, take disability out of it for a second. If someone is having a performance issue, we have to bring them in for performance management conversations. Again, put disability aside. Remember, it goes back to essential job functions. Can you perform the essential functions of the job with or without the accommodation? So if someone comes in and you're having performance, and I'm just going to make this up, but let's say there's 3 key areas, and 1 key area is where they're having challenges. And you say, you know, Nadine, you know, part B of your job, you're really not doing well. We need to have a conversation. I need to understand what's contributing to the performance issues. I want to be able to help you, right? So it's performance management. If at that point someone says, I have a disability and this is why, fine. We still have to have a performance management conversation, but now what we have to do is change it a little bit so it's a documented interactive dialogue so that I can understand What is it about that essential function that you're having challenges with, so we can talk about what accommodations you may need to rectify that. Now, let's say we have that conversation. And Nadine says, no, I don't need anything. I just want you to know this is the challenge. Well, but we have to improve performance. So then what would you suggest? This all has to be documented. Because once someone has said it's because of, and you're offering accommodations to enable them to be successful, and they choose not to accept that, performance issues then are on them. They are not on you, as long as you have documented that you followed that process. So does that make sense, I hope?
Okay, so there's Alicia, are you unmuted? Okay, so Nadine is another one here. So why do managers need to know if someone has a disability? HR can record for AAP, which is affirmative action purposes, without disclosing to managers, and managers can treat them just like anyone else.
That is absolutely true. But here's what typically happens. And again, I'm always the reality part of this. I agree 100% with what was just stated. The reality is, often, the individual says, I don't want my manager involved, I'm going to HR, I'm taking care of it, but something comes up on a project or something, and what they blurt out is, look, I have a disability, I don't know what the issue is. And now the manager has been brought into it, and like, what? I have no idea what you're talking about. And that's where we go down that slippery slope. So this is where it also comes back to, we have to help individuals with disabilities to understand that, you know, words matter and actions matter. And so if they truly want to go direct through HR and not have to engage, then they can't just off the cuff say, well, you should have known, or I don't know why HR didn't talk to you about. And that's often what happens and where we start getting into these issues.
Perfect. No more questions, Nadine.
Okay, so I think that this next piece will also answer some of these things. So that the disability disclosure guidance tool is to help someone not tell them they should or shouldn't disclose, but help them through these various processes so that they can make a good decision for themselves and an informed decision. Because no matter how much you all put out about benefits and guidance and things that you have at your organizations, typically there's so much, you talk to 10 people and 9 didn't know you had half of what you're offering. So it allows you to reinforce all of the good things that you are doing and offering in support of individuals with disabilities. So that's one piece. Another piece is this whole idea of the accommodations process. So I'm going to come to that in 1 second. I just want to make sure that from a disability disclosure guidance tool, we understand that just having it isn't enough. We have to make sure that we communicate why it's being used, how it's being used. This is not something that Big Brother is watching and we're going to check and see every single person who went on the tool. It's more of an idea to say, you can do this anonymously, it's for you, for guidance, you can present sheets, print sheets for information, things like that. So it's what's being offered and then what is being done. And what I mean by that, we have to, again, it goes back to managers. If you have a guidance tool and someone goes to the manager and says, well, I hear we have something like that, and the manager kind of poo-poos it, it's not going to be really helpful. So in your guidance tool, you should also have a section for managers in how to respond appropriately to requests. That will marry the two together and make it much more effective. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to give you a little more detail about the guidance tool itself. So the first one is basically a 3-step disclosure decision tree. And again, someone can just print this up. It helps them determine the need to disclose, when they may want to do it, and how. You want to give them examples for different disability types and different settings. Give them pros and cons. You know, there's a consequence consideration worksheet, you know, to help them think through, maybe even with their spouse or family member. Why am I disclosing? Who should I be disclosing to? And oh, by the way, how much am I sharing? This is a TMI issue. And again, it goes back to helping people with disabilities disclose. We find that if someone's disability involves a lot of medical issues, sometimes when they disclose, whoever they're disclosing to, but let's say the manager, they might say, well, you know, nobody really knows, but I've had these 3 surgeries, and I go through this medical process every 2 months, and then you know, after work, I go to the hospital and have this done. That is way too much information. Nobody at work should have that information, certainly as part of this process. But people feel very strongly about it, and often they feel that's helping them to convince the manager or convince HR why this is a serious disability or why they're disclosing. So we do have to be really sensitive to that. So if we go to the next slide, what I want to talk about is when you think about this, is that we also have to help individuals prepare for the meeting. I don't like when folks just go in, I'm here and, you know, let's talk disclosure. Help them to put a plan together. So almost like a strategic plan for their own disclosure. And then to understand what actually happens next. We've had situations where a manager or an HR person will respond and say, okay, well, what happens now is we have the interactive process, and then we're going to talk about this. And even that language sometimes throws individuals off, especially if you're talking about someone who's perhaps younger. Maybe someone who recently graduated from college. You know, the process in a college environment is a little bit different. And so they might not understand some of the language and the nuances. And then they get thrown off and get nervous. So again, it's helping them through that piece. So let's talk a little bit on the next slide about just what, you know, after you go through this, are there other pieces that we need to make sure informationally get across? So unique disclosure issues. I think this is important to address. If we have an employee that has a dependent with a disability, they don't have the disability themselves. What we have found is often they do believe that they are covered under the ADA. They don't understand that, no, they're covered under FMLA should they need that. They don't understand that there are discrimination laws around. We can't discriminate against someone because of caring for someone with a disability. And the approach is something that we have to get our arms around, because 10% of our workforce is someone who is caring for a child or other dependent with special needs. And so while the process is different, there's still ways in which we can support them, but we do need to educate how it's different so the expectations are met appropriately. And then when I mentioned earlier about management response, again, some of the things we want you to speak with your management team about are things like that initial reaction like we talked about earlier, how to describe the interactive process. What does company or firm-wide support look like? What does that actually mean? What is being offered? Accommodations, accommodation processes, responding to team concerns. Now, I do want to bring this one up because this one we're finding is a big deal. As I'm sure you're all aware, almost 25% of the complaints made to the EEOC on the part of employees with disabilities relates to bullying and harassment. Now, this is different bullying and harassment than what we see in middle school, but it's still an issue. And what I mean by that is I go to my manager and I disclose. And my manager agrees to, I'm just going to make this up, 3 days a week I can come in late, I have to go for some medical treatments. It's a very small team. Unbeknownst to me, my few teammates go to the manager and say, I don't know what's going on with Nadine, but she's in late every other day. Why are you allowing this? What's going on? And the manager responds in one of two ways, inappropriately. The manager will respond by saying, well, Gail, don't tell anybody, but, and then spews out my confidential information. Or instead of doing that, comes back to me and says, Nadine, at our next team meeting, I'm getting a lot of pressure from the team. They don't understand, why you're not here a lot. We were under a lot of pressure at the company. I really need you to just say a few things. Give some idea about what's going on. Well, that's bullying. That's harassment. And managers don't see it that way. They see it as I'm trying to make everyone happy. We have to counsel our management teams that if someone else on the team goes to them in that manner, that the response should be, I can't speak to you about anyone else on the team. If for some reason there's some issues you're having relative to the essential functions of your job, I'd be happy to have a conversation with you. You want to talk about performance? When you start going down that road, they're going to back off. They are going to back off. But that conversation does need to take place. So, does that make sense for everyone? Let me just stop again and see if there's any questions.
Nadine, this is Gail. I don't see any questions.
Okay, great. So let's talk about the next slide where we're going to go into reasonable accommodations processes. So first thing, and again, you all know this as well as I do. Although a process is not required, it's what it is, because what we do say is that accommodations in terms of how you make them should be fair, equitable, and consistent across the footprint of the enterprise. So what does that mean? First, when a request is made, how is it made? And where is it made? If we have a situation where, and I see this all the time in decentralized organizations, well, that person goes to the HR person for their local distribution center and they handle everything locally. Well, if that individual makes a decision that is different than the HR person in a different distribution center dealing with someone with the exact same disability and need, it is no longer consistent and no longer equitable. And that's where we often get into trouble. So we have to set up a process that no matter how someone makes the request, that it's going in and going to be evaluated in the same way. So first, best practice. If you have the process such that the person can make the request on your intranet site, that you have the process set up so that no matter what function I'm in, what level in the organization, what geography I'm in, the way in which I'm making the request, the way in which you're going to receive it and evaluate is going to be identical. That's number one. Number two, it should clearly state, once I submit this, who's going to see it? What is the turnaround time? You know, who's involved in the process? What does that next step look like? These are all really important steps. Now, when you have the process, it can also be that if there are certain individuals that need to weigh in, that they have access. So it might be employment law or whoever is going to be on your team working on this. But let me just give you a story, a quick one, as to why this is so important. Very large global pharmaceutical company. It really had what I would consider an amazing accommodations team. It was a fairly large team. Someone called into the team when they had a request, and they had a dialogue. The dialogue was documented, and it went on from there. So one particular situation was that an individual had made the request, the organization provided an accommodation wasn't working, they were going back and forth. Well, he decided to file a formal complaint and said the company was not supporting him and honoring his needs for accommodations. What happened was, when they got to the point where the person from the accommodations team had to be deposed to understand their end of the story and what happened, she had file folders this big. Copious notes from every conversation, from every accommodation, the whole bit. The challenge was, those were only her side of that was only her side of the documentation. So the individual with the disability said, well, I'm glad you have all that, but those are your words. That's not what I told you. That's not what I said. That's not what I, everything was a challenge, right? That was your interpretation of it. If the system was set up, now conversations could still have taken place, but if the system was set up that I, as the individual with the disability, completed everything, made the requests, whatever commentary were on the system, it would be documented in my own words. This way, if a response back or an offer for an accommodation was different or inappropriate, then we'd have true documentation. The other part of it was, then he also said, I have a friend who's working in another part of the organization and got a different person on the accommodations team to help them, and they have a very different outcome. So the accommodations process in and of itself, really, really important. I don't know how many of you, we have almost 500 people on this session today. I don't know how many of you have a process. It can be very complex, but it can also be really simplified. We've created processes for organizations just using Excel spreadsheets and email. You want to set up criteria. This is really important. And everybody can have different criteria, every organization, meaning you can say if the accommodation request is coming in for something that's going to cost, and I'm just going to make this up, less than $500, it's just automatically going to happen. If it's between 501 and 1,000, here's the process. Or if it's for ergonomic reasons, then here's the process. But this way, you have the criteria established. It shows it up front. Nobody feels like they're being treated differently for some reason, and it's communicated. The same goes true, by the way, if for some reason you deny the request. It should be in writing. Why the denial, what the process is, if they want to come back, when they can come back to it. If maybe the accommodation that you're providing is different, they're asking for a $1,000 chair, you have a $50 chair alternative. To be able to have all of that documented in writing. And this protects everyone, by the way. This is a risk mitigation issue. I always look for when we're working with companies, I always say there's two parts. There's the opportunity and there's the risk. This is about risk mitigation both for you as the organization, because everything will be documented out and laid out and shown that it is equal, fair, and consistent, and for the individual with the disability. Because you know, sometimes when it's your own situation, sometimes it's hard to see the forest through the trees. But if they can go back and look at their own documentation that they submitted, their own words, sometimes it helps them to realize a little bit more about what they asked for and what was done. So I hope that makes sense. I'm going to stop there before we transition to self-identification. Any questions or comments?
Nadine, this is Alicia. I have one question in queue that states, bullying by teammates is nasty and tough to live with. How best to manage this, with or without managers helping?
Yeah, so, you know, I'm not a violent person, but no. I'll just say that both my daughters have experienced bullying and harassment in workplace settings. And, you know, in those situations, I just want to put my mom hat on and, you know, what I want to do. So you're right, bullying and harassment is just nasty, right? Children who are bullies grow up and they stay bullies, unfortunately. One of the things that really helps, and it goes to corporate culture, and we are actually going to spend some time on this in today's session, is having an allies program, so that we have people that are standing up for us and are saying things that hopefully will actually never let that harassment happen in the first place. If it does, though, if you're in a situation, the first thing I want to say is to try to diffuse it and really break it down and say, I'm not sure what message you're trying to send. Can you explain to me what the challenge is? I'm sure you don't intend, I'm sure you're not intentionally trying to bully me, but this is how I'm feeling. You have to just be open, right? You have to put it out there. And the person's going to probably respond in one of two ways and say, no, that was not my intention, and you can go have a good conversation. Or they might say, well, I just think that you're taking advantage and you don't really have a disability and whatever it may be. And that's where you have to stop them and say, you know what, I don't think this is a conversation for the two of us to have, because my disability is actually very personal. So maybe you should talk to our manager or you should talk to HR. So you're putting it back on them. It's not your problem. It's now their problem. And that will sometimes diffuse it as well. But it is a tough place, I got to tell you. That is not easy for anyone. So thank you for asking that. Any other questions?
I have two more questions. The next, if you have to rescind an offer to
you're Alicia, I can't understand you. I'm not sure what happened to your sound.
Can you hear me now?
It's so muffled, Alicia. Nadine, I can ask the question on Alicia's behalf. I'm not sure.
Great.
Okay.
Okay.
So, this is Gail. So if you have to rescind an offer to an applicant, how best would you recommend to do this, verbally, in writing, or both?
Always do it in writing. Document, document, document. So we always want to do it in writing. Some companies have set up policies internally that say they do not want you to do it verbally, even if you've already sent something in writing. So that one seems to be more of a company decision. About everybody agrees it should be in writing. Some companies feel strongly not to have a verbal after that, and some feel that from a cultural standpoint, I think it's still person to person, it would be good to still have that conversation and enable that person to at least ask more questions. But again, if they do and you do that, document what that conversation was.
It looks like, Nadine, we have one more here, which is, what is the most have you seen an employer pay? Whoops, just took it off. What is the most have you seen an employer pay for an accommodation?
Oh, wow. So I'm going to answer that two ways, I guess, because when we talk about an accommodation in and of itself, it is for an individual, right? So it's something specific that that individual needs. And sometimes I've seen a new employee come in and the doorway, to the office isn't wide enough, or they have to change some of the furniture, and it could be in the thousands of dollars, equipment, et cetera. There was one recently in the UK that was, I want to say it was over $8,000 what they did for this individual. Having said that, what's more of a best practice, and it's all of you that can help with this, is to really help the company understand that although we need to accommodate individuals as they need it, if we take a step back and we really consider the process of universal design and we look at everybody's needs more holistically, at the end of the day, they're really, in the long term, going to spend less money and have more needs met overall. So I am finding that some best practice companies out there are starting to talk to their employees with disabilities to better understand more broad-based what the needs are, to see if they can take a step back and fix things more holistically. So we have, at Springboard, we have a dedicated physical accessibility universal design team. We have a dedicated digital accessibility team. And the teams actually are seeing it because the companies are bringing them in, and that's what they're asking for. They're saying we want to take more of a universal design approach so that we're helping the masses and may not need to do these one-offs as much as we have been. So that's actually the good news. So thank you. All right, so let's go on to self-ID. Now, with self-ID, first let me just say this, and I know you guys know this just as well, if not better than I do. Self-identification is confusing to people. And Yvette, if we can go to the next slide, please. Self-identification is confusing in that we have companies that are confusing the terms. They use disclosure and self-ID in the same sentence. And so that immediately sets off confusion. And so then we have to explain, because if you think about it just from the English language, when you say self-identification, it does sound like I'm identifying myself and saying it's me with the disability, whereas that's actually disclosure. Self-ID is our form, right? Yes, no, don't want to tell. So it does require a little explanation, one, as to, just from the English language, that it is different, why it's different, and how it plays out. Now, there's a lot of companies that are, when they are talking about self-ID, they're almost using this term of the government is making me do it. And if you look at the company messaging or the campaigning, they're almost apologizing for asking someone to do it and say, look, it's the OFCCP, it's not us, it's because we're a federal contractor, we wouldn't ask, but we really need to. That's not the way to do this, right? We have to tie it into who you are as an organization, how it aligns with your beliefs in diversity and inclusion, and maybe even illustrate other aspects of D&I and show how you don't need to know specifics, but it will make a difference from a budgetary standpoint if I know that 1,000 people have a disability versus 10 people. Right? So the way in which we talk about that's really important. The other thing we do say is, well, self-ID, it's anonymous, right? You're not going to put your name on it. Nobody's going to know. Can I just tell you, no matter what company, industry, or country we go to, almost no one believes it's anonymous. What we usually hear is, well, I believe that it probably is anonymous today, or the intention of the company is to have it anonymous. But, you know, we're going to have a reorg, and the next CEO that comes in or the next leader, they may change that. I don't trust the system. We hear that more than anything. So we have to figure out how to help folks really trust the system. And the only way to do that, and we're going to talk a little more in a minute, is about that company culture. What are we doing as an organization beyond just, here's what the government's making us do, here's the legal language, to show that it's seamlessly integrated into our company DNA. We have to explain what's in it for the individual. And, you know, if someone says, well, I don't need an accommodation right now, so I don't need to do this, you may not need it now. But if you do at some point, if we have already seen that we have enough people that need these services, and we've been able then to get the company to put budget behind it from a universal design perspective and have things in place, think how much better it can be. That's really important. The other thing to think about with this is, you know, we've had a lot of folks that have said, I'm not sure this pertains to me. I was born with spina bifida, but, you know, I walked with crutches as a child, but you can see I walk fine. I mean, I just have a limp now. I don't really think I have a disability. This doesn't really refer to me or apply to me. So again, we have to help educate individuals with disabilities that when we say do have, don't want to tell, what do we really mean by that? What are we asking? We're not saying anything negative about disability or about the individuals that check those boxes, but there's a lot of confusion. And what we're finding is the way in which a company messages about this not only adds to the confusion, but adds to these concerns that we're hearing from the individuals themselves. So if we go to the next slide, it goes back to what I said earlier about disclosure and organization. What is being said about self-identification? What are you offering in terms of helping folks understand what it means, its applicability to the organization, what's in it for them, and then at the end of the day, what's being done? And what I mean by that is, you know, we've been going through self-ID now for a few years. So let's say you're instituting some new trainings or processes or programs in the organization for people with disabilities. To be able to speak to the reason we're able to do this, the reason we've been able to get budget and buy-in from management to do this is thank you to all of you, because you have completed your self-ID forms. It's allowed us to understand just what a large percentage of individuals with disabilities we have in the organization and what we need to do to support you. So you have to, it's almost like the smell test, right? What have we said about it? What are we offering relative to it? And then at the end of the day, how do we show what's being done as a result of it? So I hope that makes sense. Let me stop again and see if there's any questions, because then I want to give you some practices, some best practices around this.
Hi, Nadine. This is Alicia. Is that better?
Yes, much. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
We have quite a few questions.
Okay.
I will start with the first. If a remote employee requests a special ergonomic chair for their home office due to back issues, how do we handle that if they have not disclosed a disability?
So, this has come up a lot since COVID, right? And everybody's working from home. So I will just share with you, when everybody first started working from home at the beginning of this, so like February, March, April, we actually had companies come to us and say, you know, John said that he has a disability and now needs all this stuff at home. He didn't need any of that in the office. Why does he need it at home? This is his home. He should be set up just fine. Not understanding that, yes, it's his home, but he might not have had his home set up as a 9-to-5 office. And the functions that he needs to do there, that in a large office environment might already been in place. So that's really the basis and nature of what's happening here. So you have to go through the same process as you would if the person was in the office, right? So tell me what's happening. It goes to performance. Are you having trouble? Yes. Because of my back, I just can't sit at the desk and work 8 hours a day. I'm not sure what to do. Okay, we're going to start having a dialogue. What are the issues? Everything that you would do from conversation, interactive dialogue, documentation, if you need someone to evaluate ergonomically. A lot of companies now have, they either outsource or they have in-source programs to evaluate ergonomic requests. You still have to go through that same process if that person is officially working from home for the company. And whether that remote worker is working part-time, full-time, if they're saying it's affecting performance that is related to that job, you have to go with it.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Yes, we have a couple. If an employee refuses to have a phone conversation because she prefers to have the interactive in writing, can we tell employee that due to the breakdown in the interactive process and the refusal of the employee to join in an interactive discussion, we will determine that this is a refusal to participate in good faith and close the case? Question mark.
So, my opinion is yes. My opinion is based on many of our own clients having an experience like that and doing that. What I would say with that, though, is that presents a hotbed of issues. And I would say for a situation like that, I would actually consult with your own employment law professional within your organization to determine not what your position is in that particular case, but what your position, and have a positioning statement about that is consistent across, that should any situation like that come up, that will be your position. Does that make, I hope that makes sense.
It makes sense, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Next question. We have two similar about self-ID. The first asks, can you explain the difference in self-ID and disclosure again?
No. No, I'm only kidding. So the easiest way, when I have conversations with individuals with disabilities or with managers, I always like to break it down to really simple. Disclosure is that I'm going to go to an individual, my manager, HR, whomever. I'm going to go to an individual and identify myself. It's me. I have an issue that I need an accommodation on, or I have an issue, I don't need an accommodation today, but I want you to understand it maybe either it's affecting my performance now or maybe in the future, and here's why. Here's how it plays out, right? I'm identifying myself with the need. Self-ID, it is anonymous. I'm just checking a form as more for accounting purpose than anything for the company. Yes, I have a disability. No, I don't, or I don't want to tell. So I'm not putting my name, my face attached to it in any way. I am not sharing that I have any performance issue potentially either now or in the future related to it. It's really just a form that I'm checking so that you as an organization get a sense of what your numbers look like from a tracking standpoint to determine then what you may or may not be doing in the organization. That is the simplest. There's a lot of legal ways to describe it, obviously. I'm going to leave all that to you. What I find works is that I just bring it to just basic. Someone can literally visually, and this is going to make sense in my next comments, someone can literally visually imagine, okay, I'm walking up to you, here's what I'm saying, or I'm just filling out a form. I like to describe things visually. It helps people really get a sense of what we mean.
Okay. That's a great lead-in for the next question regarding self-ID. This question states, self-ID is not considered anonymous for the federal contractor. With that said, why would we communicate it as being anonymous, in quote?
Because that's my point. Everybody is communicating that's anonymous.
Yes.
Everybody is saying nobody's going to know. It's just, it's for these 5 people. That is exactly it in a nutshell.
Yes.
That's the problem. Thank you.
Yes. Yes. Two more questions.
Okay.
You mentioned, okay, the next one, you mentioned companies may use the disability status to create programs to help ensure accommodations are being made. Enhance accommodations, or at minimum, use this information to talk about it within the organization.
Yes.
How does the manager and our leader obtain this information considering its confidential disclosure? And the person is referring to data transparency.
So we're not referring, when we do this, we're not referring to individuals.
Okay.
We're talking about the bigger, broader organization. Saying that, you know, we realize that a very large percentage, or a larger percentage than we ever thought in the organization, have and experience disabilities. So as a result, we realize we need to do more. We need to do better. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not actually talking about where we're going to, okay, you have 2 people on your team, and therefore. That's not what we're talking about.
Okay, enterprise. Next question. How would you suggest an employee respond to their manager when the manager discloses on the coworker's behalf? I have hesitated to disclose in previous jobs because I've had managers talk to me about coworkers' disabilities.
So the scenario is, so let me understand. So the scenario is that a manager is coming to you and talking to you about someone else's disability, or you hear the manager telling someone else about your disability?
It sounds like the manager is going to the employee to talk to them about someone else's disability.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So the first comment that I would, if a manager was to come to me and I'm the colleague in the organization and say, let's say they say, you know, Nadine, I just want to, can I talk to you confidentially? You know, I know that you've had experience with disability, and I'm just experiencing a challenge, and I'm wondering if you can help me. You know, your colleague, Yvette, recently shared with me, like, I wouldn't even let them get past that sentence. And to say, oh my gosh, thank you, you know, I'm so honored that you feel comfortable to talk to me about this. But I'm sure, as you know, this would cross lines of confidentiality because I'm not in an appropriate role. I'm not in HR. I'm not in an appropriate role to have the conversation. So it's really better for you, for me, and for the individual if you don't share anymore. What I would suggest is, why don't you go to, whether it's HR or employee relations or wherever you think. But I would stop them right there. What happens sometimes is instead we hear them out. And then we say, you know, you really shouldn't have told me, but so you're better off stopping it. You don't want to be rude, but if you do it in a very professional manner that, look, I'm protecting you and me and the individual by stopping this conversation, that should work.
Okay, okay. And last question that's up in queue. If an employee has back issues and does not disclose this, but regularly lays down on the office floor for relief, how would you approach?
Well, so I think it depends if the person has their own private office. You know, if a person has a private office where they can close a door and they can lie down, and then, you know, I just happen to walk in and see them lying on the floor as long as I know they're not having a medical emergency, you know, I think it's okay. I don't think they need to disclose that if they're doing that in private, and it's not taking away from them getting their job done. Obviously, if they're going to go into, let's say the team has a conference room, and every time you walk into the conference room, the person is laying on the floor on their back, that might be a challenge because now it's impacting other people, like wondering what's going on. So if, let's say you're the manager, and you see that happening, then what you have to do is have a conversation with that individual and just say, that's not that's not acceptable practice for anyone to be laying on the floor. And if the person says, you know what, it's just my back is really hurting me, then, you know, fine, but maybe you can take a break and go, you know, again, some companies have like mental health rooms and other rooms that someone can go lay down in. So it depends on how you're set up to have that conversation. Now, if the manager finds that every time they walk in, this person is laying down and it's impacting their performance, then the conversation isn't so much about laying on their back all the time, even though that's still inappropriate. It has to go back to performance. I think that's what we get caught up with. When I talk to managers who are aware of or make an assumption that someone has a disability, when it involves or impacts performance, they forget that the conversation has to be first and foremost about the performance, and they get very tongue-tied and upset about the disability, and they go right for the disability piece. And we have to remember that that has to be secondary to the performance issue. That make sense, I hope?
Great example. Okay.
Yeah?
We have 3 more questions, so the call is up to you, Nadine.
Let's see. Let's do this. Let me finish this one piece just to give you guys some best practices around this, around self-ID, and it might answer a couple of questions.
Okay.
And then we'll come back to the questions. So let's go to the next slide. So if someone was, so I mentioned earlier that someone might say, you know, I don't think I have a disability. I'm not sure if this relates to me, or check the box. And let's say that person goes to HR. And Gail, they come to you and they say, well, Gail, you know, here's my story. Do you think I should check the box or not? You really can't guide them yes or no. They have to make that decision for themselves. So what some companies have started to do is have no more than 3 to 5 minute video vignettes. And they're just 2 actors, let's say, having a conversation, playing out a scenario like the one I just described, but playing it out with each other. I watch that and I say, oh, okay, I really relate to this person or that person, and then it helps me make a good decision if I should be checking yes, no, or indifferent. It's a very non-threatening, informative way to help folks through the process. It also sometimes we find helps managers to see it, because then they have a better understanding of what folks with disabilities may be going through or considering. And by the way, you can have a similar process on disclosure, but we're finding companies are doing this more around the self-ID piece. Communications, like I mentioned earlier, use things that will show this is going beyond a government requirement, and then it ties to your inclusive practices. The other thing that I think is really important about this is the timing of your communications. When are you putting information out there about self-ID? You know, it's interesting because we've had companies starting to say, you know, I'm just making it, we think it's important enough that we're making it part of when we do open enrollment. We're making it part of any time we have a program that talks about inclusive practices or things that we want to add to the company, we just mention that we have this and that we do this and why we do it. So it's not talked about just like once a year kind of thing. Again, it's going to be up to your organization and your organization's culture how you do this, but these are just some of the best practices that are really coming out of this as we're going forward. So if we go to the next slide, it's just a reminder that these 2 terms are not interchangeable, and we have to help all of the folks that work in your organization understand that, 1, they're not interchangeable, they're just at the end of the day not the same thing. So with that, if you can forward 2 slides to the 4 Ps, and I'm going to stop here before we do that to just come back again and ask, I think you said you had a couple more questions, so let me take them before we go more into the culture piece.
Okay, thank you. The first, any suggestions where to get the video vignettes? Are there any that we can use?
Yeah, so what we're finding is most of the companies are either creating them themselves in-house, or we can certainly help you and create them for you, with you, but there's no, I've looked, there do not seem to be any just off-the-shelf ones, because companies want to tailor them more to their industry, their business. Let's say we're at a university, so you want to tailor it more to a university setting, and we want to use words like, you know, faculty and staff and resident advisors, or, you know, things that relate to that particular company or industry. So I haven't seen any off the shelf. If folks have some questions after, you can reach out to me and we can, you know, brainstorm together and see how to get those.
Excellent. The next question, how do you feel about employees using a fibromyalgia information card, informing people why they might not be responsive or that they're going through a flare-up moment? Is this appropriate? Because at this point, other employees will be aware of the condition.
Yeah, you remember we talked earlier about TMI, too much information?
Yeah.
This would fall under that umbrella. We actually have had many individuals with disabilities ask us about how to better get their colleagues to be sensitive to or understand their needs. So there have been some individuals that have said, I don't mind if my colleagues know because of where my disability has gotten. I would rather share it in a meeting and answer questions so they don't think I'm just being lazy or I'm just being this or that. If management and HR and everybody is comfortable with that, and I will say that there are many companies that are not comfortable with that. They say that because of legal issues, they just not comfortable. If you're in an organization where you are comfortable, I think that's okay. But to just start handing out like a deck of cards, here's the information on cerebral palsy today, here's the information on fibromyalgia today, that's going to get really overwhelming. And the problem is, then you're going to have folks in the LGBTQ community want to talk about transition and want to talk, where do you end with it? Cancer, different types of cancer. That's not the place for, the business is not the place for that.
Hi, Nadine, this is Gail. I have another question here in chat.
Yep.
Can HR Human Resources, ever share the reason why an employee is out on leave if the employee has requested confidentiality? The direct manager and executives often want to know what the reason is for the leave.
No, you first of all, even if the employee has not requested confidentiality, it's confidential information. So no, that should not, as you all know, EEOC always likes to say when a lot of these questions come up, the person needs to be on a need-to-know basis. Let's take it out of this and think about if someone is interviewing for a job. And during the job interview, they mention to the recruiter that they have a learning disability. And they get into a conversation, and the person says, I'm not requesting any accommodations. I've never needed any. I just want to be, upfront and just let you know I have it. Is that recruiter obligated, or even should they tell the next person in line that's going to interview this person? And the EEOC is pretty clear and says, is that next person, do they need to know for some reason? Is it impacting their ability, this individual's ability to interview? Is it impacting their ability to take a test if that's needed? Is it impacting their ability to perform the essential functions that's expected of that job? If not, then what's the reason other than curiosity? So, no. Long-winded answer to a short question, sorry.
I've got one more here. Do you recommend putting the opportunity to self-ID on the bottom of standard emails from our office?
My personal belief is the more we communicate and the more we, and I don't like this word, but I'm going to use it for this purpose, the more we normalize, make things part of our process as opposed to the exceptions and the special things, the better. The more people will get comfortable with the language, with why things are being asked. So my personal opinion is communicate, communicate, communicate wherever and whenever appropriate, and people will just start becoming less fearful of that one time a year, it comes out.
I don't see any on my end, but I'd like to ask Alicia. Alicia, do you see another question on your end?
I have one more.
Okay, and then I want to be sensitive to timing and make sure we get through the next round.
Yes.
So go ahead.
Thank you. If we need to message self-ID as the company culture, how do we incorporate the required OMB form?
So every company has done that really differently. That's a conversation that what we would need to do is look at what the communication is you're putting out, what other types of communication you put out that is similar in nature. Usually before we do anything like that, we meet with your employment law, compliance person, yourselves as part of this process, and HR, and look at it as a holistic plan and say, okay, here's what makes sense for us. There's no one right way to do it. So we would have to look at that to make that determination.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Okay, so what I want to do now is transition a little bit. I mean, it all relates because we've been talking about company culture. And there are 4 Ps: principles, promises, policies, and practices. And so let's break this down. I'm going to start with principles. So Yvette, if you want to go to the next slide, principles they're foundational statements. These are statements that are adopted by an organization that guide future decisions, right? They're value statements. Do no harm. Challenge the status quo. So think about what's your principle? What is your foundational statement for your organization? So we just took one from a client we work with that says they intentionally develop a workforce with diverse viewpoints, skills, experiences, and abilities. That makes a statement, right? That's something that guides their future decisions. It's not about EEOC and we're just fair to everyone. What they're saying is they are intentionally including people with different abilities. That's important. Let's go to the next one. So the next one is promises. Promises is a brand promise. It's a value or an experience for a company's customers, their candidates, even their employees, that they should come to expect whenever they interact with the organization. So I just gave you a general one from Coca-Cola. They say to inspire moments of optimism and uplift. Now I'm going to give you one from a client relative to disability. Offer more fashion choices for people of all shapes, sizes, and abilities. They're looking at fashion and clothing that will be easy for someone, let's say, who's in a wheelchair to be able to dress themselves independently. That's a promise that they're making. Right? This is all cultural stuff. This has nothing to do with EEOC, legal, none of it. But it's so important because at the end of the day, this is what's going to be the foundation for you to be successful in the work that you're doing. So let's go to the next one, which is policies. Now this one certainly relates to all you guys, right? What's a policy? It's something that's a guideline to help employers deal with whether it's employee accountability, health, safety, interactions with customers, let's say at a call center, legal issues, regulatory requirements, any situation that could lead to a consequence, right? But it's also about helping to foster employee wellness, fair treatment, and to ensure that a company is following the laws and regulations. So when it comes to that employee wellness and fair treatment, this is where I go back to, do you have to have a formal reasonable accommodations process that's fair, equitable, consistent? No. But should you? It comes back to what's the company stand for, right? So the other thing I want to bring up on the next slide about policies is that if you look at your policies, it's about really adding an inclusive statement. I don't know if you can switch the slide, but adding an inclusive statement to that policy, because that's what goes a long way to show what your commitment is. You know, when someone looks at a company policy, a company handbook, they look at it like, all right, this is all the stuff you're required to tell me. But if you add a statement like the one you see here, we take affirmative steps to employ, retain, and advance qualified individuals with disabilities at all levels. You're adding an inclusive statement on top of the formal legal language, if you will. It makes a statement about who the organization is and your commitment to this work, beyond just what the government says you have to do, beyond just, compliance. So let's go to the next slide and talk about the practices, right? Practices are the actual methods, the procedures, the processes that's followed by the company. The reality is, as we talked about it up till now, the practices are not always reflective of the principles and policies that the institution says it has towards individuals with disabilities. It's not always aligning with the unique needs of this segment of the population. So the problem is that when that happens, you have a disconnect. And many of today's practices then reinforce the belief of, we talked about this earlier, unconscious bias, which then creates self-fulfilling prophecies. Oh, I knew that someone with this disability type would never be able to do this. Oh, and then I see that's true because the practices are not really supporting the inclusive nature of what we say we're doing, right? So let me give you some examples of that. Next slide, why the disconnect. So the first reason when we look at this is that we have a lack of or inconsistent buy-in and accountability. Here's where we find this. You might have buy-in from the top, and we have buy-in at, let's say, our disability employee resource group level, but that middle layer of management, perhaps not. They're saying, oh my gosh, there's so much on my plate, I don't get why this is so important, and they just sit there, and they freeze up. It's something called the frozen middle. They freeze up the work, the intentionality of what we want to do. There's also often a lack of allyship, and I brought this up before, and what I'm going to do after this, I want to go through what I mean by allyship and the different ways I would love for all of you to reinforce how to be an ally specifically in this arena. There's inconsistent or inappropriate training. You brought up earlier, someone brought up a question about, let me hand out a card on my disability so people will know how to react and act to me. The number one global best practice, and almost always the first practice, is disability etiquette and awareness training. Now, that is not theoretical. That's, I go to shake your hand, you have a prosthetic device. Do I know what to shake? We're having a conversation, you're using a wheelchair. Do I sit, stand, or kneel during the conversation, and why? We're having a conversation and you're using an interpreter. Do I look at the interpreter? Do I look at you? Very practical. Visible disabilities, invisible disabilities. So we're not pointing the finger at any one individual or any one disability. We're helping people understand whether the disability is visible, invisible, it doesn't matter, how to communicate, engage, work side by side in a way that I'm comfortable and I make the other person comfortable at the same time. We need to do that. The problem is when we see companies do that, they'll do it in October for Disability Awareness Month, and then we don't talk about it again for another year. That's inconsistent. Or they're giving training that is very focused on one disability type, and everybody then just focuses on that and doesn't get that broad understanding of how to interact. Obviously, we talked about this a lot, processes that are not fair, equitable or consistent. We're not communicating beyond compliance or the compliance focus. Lack of guidance and resources. So, we'll hear management say, we just don't have the budget to focus on disability this year. Well, that makes no sense. Then they're saying we don't have the budget to focus on our people. So we have to go back and talk the business case. Also, we have invisible career development and promotion of individuals with disabilities. I was just having a conversation with a chief accessibility officer of a large bank, and we are both on the bandwagon to really start talking publicly people with disabilities as leaders. Not as entry-level, not to get entry-level positions, not to get part-time positions, but actually as the managers and the vice presidents, the leaders within the companies. And that when that does happen, and it does, we have to make that much more visible. And I don't like making someone the show pony, if you will, but sometimes we need to do that to get that point across. And the other thing for the disconnect is that sometimes there's an award focus. Now, this might sound funny coming from me. We have Disability Matters, which is our annual, conference and awards gala. But we have had organizations come to us and say, Nadine, we just won an award for X, something to do with disability, or we just got a top score for something. And then they whisper. And they say, I'm not really sure how we got that. I mean, I know we're compliant, but I think you're going to need to help us because now we better do some stuff because we got this award and now we have to show we deserve it. That's a real backwards approach. That's a disconnect, and things aren't going to be done appropriately or sustainably if that's what happens. So let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit about training. I touched on it, but I want to give you a little more information. Right? So we talked that a lot of folks are talking about unconscious bias. If someone doesn't own the bias, especially when it comes to disability, their behavior will not change. You will have spent a lot of time, money, and effort training your folks. Behaviors will not change. If I don't believe that I have bias, I'm thinking I'm sitting in here, but you're talking to someone else, not me. So we have to switch up how we talk about it, number one. Number two, from an etiquette and awareness standpoint, make it practical, make it about engagement, and make sure it's not just about one disability type. Experiential learning. Some companies are afraid to do this, but it's really important. And you explain to folks, if you're taking on the role of someone of a disability today, and you're going to use a wheelchair for 4 hours while you're working, It in no way is the same thing as living your life using a wheelchair. Can't be. But it's the closest you're going to get to having some understanding of what I do to get from point A to point B in the organization, how I get from the 12th floor to the 5th floor when I only have 3 minutes between meetings, things like that. Immersion, HR, talent acquisition. We need to make sure they have the immersion training that they need, because think about it, at the end of the day, when managers have questions or concerns, where do they go? They go to HR, they go to employee relations. We hear from the HR teams all the time, Nadine, I am not equipped to truly handle this. And oh, by the way, with COVID, we're hearing that more and more, because they're hearing from folks that are depressed, having anxiety, feeling isolated, and they're taking it in, and then they have to develop their own resilience, because then these HR folks are taking that home, and they're bringing those feelings home to their own families, and they don't know how to deal with it. So we really, really have to help them, and in this age of COVID, more than ever, and even more than ever as it relates to this mental health perspective. The other is essential job functions. We've had way too many organizations say we don't have time to write essential job functions. We have job descriptions, or if we think someone has a disability, we'll ask, or we don't ask because we don't have them. I can't tell you how many times I hear, well, we haven't been sued yet, so I'm not going to worry about it. This is important. Now, it's important not just to talk about them, but whoever creates the job requisitions, to help them understand, provide guidance to them, what goes into an essential job function? What are the characteristics? How is it different than the job description? And what is the implications of not having them? Because remember, the essential job function, one, helps us understand, is the individual qualified for the job? Two, if they ask for a reasonable accommodation, that it is reasonable. It's not reasonable for someone to ask for an accommodation that would completely eliminate an essential job function. And then also for performance management, again, to be fair and equitable. These are the items we have to think about. We have to think about the type of training, the frequency, the delivery method, who the audience is, because not everybody needs all of this. And are there some parts of training relative to this topic that need to be required? And I know that organizations struggle with required training, but at the end of the day, there's so much on our plates that there are certain individuals that do need to make this mandatory and have this information, whether they, like I like to say, whether they like it or want it or not. So let's talk now about allyship, because here's where the rubber is going to meet the road, and it relates to one of the questions that was brought up earlier. So Yvette, if you can forward to allyship, please. Allyship is a huge area when it comes to corporate culture. Some companies will say, well, if people want to be allies for others, they can be. That's not a problem. In order to have this work, they need to insist on it. We need leaders to serve as models of being allies when and wherever possible. The person does not need to have a disability to be an ally for someone with a disability. They do need to take action to support them. So some of the questions that came up earlier, this will start reinforcing the how. An ally does not have to be an executive or some senior person. Everyone, no matter part-time, entry level, it doesn't matter. Everyone has a role in being an ally and how to do that. So let's go to the next slide, and I want to show you there are 7 different types of allies. And I want you to think of this relative to disability. These can be very simple efforts, but it's the simplest ones that make the most difference. And it has to be effective. If it's passive, it's not going to be effective. So we have a sponsor, a champion, an amplifier, an advocate, a scholar, an upstander, and a confidant. So let's go through this. So let's start with the next one, which is sponsor. So Yvette, if you can switch to sponsor, please. So for a sponsor, 1, talking. We have to talk about the expertise we see in this other person, especially if we're having a reorg or a new opportunity comes about. That's the time, identify this individual with a disability and talk about their expertise, because we have assumptions that because they have X disability, they probably don't have that expertise. Next is to recommend that individual for stretch assignments or opportunities to even just acquire new skills. Often we find assumptions about individuals with disabilities that they either don't need to, want to, or don't have the ability to acquire different skills and take on stretch assignments. The other thing is, if you're going to be their sponsor, you want to share their career goals with other stakeholders. Again, we find assumptions are being made, and so someone may make an assumption, well, you know, Nadine, you know, she's blind. I don't think that she would ever want to do these type of jobs. Well, how do we know that? So as my sponsor, you need to advocate for me in that way. So let's go to the next one, Yvette, which is champion. If you're in a meeting and a question comes up about an event, provide opportunities to the individual rather than yourself. So you're in a meeting and someone says, you know, we're having a really big event. Gal, you know, I think you've done this before, so why don't I just have you speak? If you turned around and said, actually, you know, I think Nadine would be great at that. And everybody, you know, might get quiet. But here's why. I actually would even suggest that we could either do it together or she could even take my place. Now you're championing for that individual. Let's talk the next one, amplifier. So with an amplifier, Yvette, with an amplifier, repeat. When that individual is in the meeting and they propose a good idea, repeat it and give them credit. We find more often than not, if someone with a disability is the one that's proposing the idea, people talk over them. It's like they don't hear them or they shake their head and they keep going. See, you know, I don't know if everybody heard what Nadine just said. Help create that or enforce almost a code of conduct for meetings around communications so that that individual does feel like they can speak up and be heard. So maybe it's when the manager asks for ideas, the code of conduct is, instead of saying, raise your hand if you have an idea, we go to every single person and ask them, and they would have to actually say no if they think they don't have an idea. Help that individual behind the scenes to take on visible roles in terms of maybe presenting at a meeting. If you have an internal newsletter, writing for the newsletter, help you with something so maybe your name is the main name on it, but they can put their name toward it. Something that, again, you're amplifying who they are in the organization. Next slide, we're going to talk about being an advocate. If you see that that individual is not being included in meetings, important meetings, ask why. Stand up. Why isn't Nadine being included? Well, whatever the issue is, advocate for them to be included. Introduce that person to influential people in your network, because they may not be able to do that on their own for a variety of reasons. Help them do that. Ask them to contribute or co-author a proposal or a conference submission that you're working on. Maybe you're going to be speaking at the National ILG, right? Maybe you could bring that individual in on that presentation with you. So then after the presentation conference is over and you go back to your company and you share and talk about what you did, they now see that person on stage with you. They see what the capabilities are of that individual. Next slide is talking about the scholar. So if you're going to be a scholar for this person, you need to understand who they are, like who their group represents. You need to learn about whether it's fibromyalgia or it's Down syndrome or whatever it may be. If you really want to help them, you need to know more about what they go through. You might ask coworkers or friends of yours that have had similar experiences. Not talking about that individual, but just in general, I'm trying to learn more about. It's very difficult for you to participate in every, resource group that you have in the organization. But if you can, participate yourself in the disability resource group or have someone on your team do that so that they're learning more, they're hearing more about the language that then you can convey beyond the standard compliance information. Next slide, I'm going to talk about the upstander. When you're an upstander, you're speaking up for this person. So someone said earlier, if I see someone being harassed or I'm being harassed, speak up. If you witness this behavior or speech that is degrading and offensive. Let's say you're walking down the hall and you feel like someone's not speaking appropriately to the individual. Just walk up to the conversation and say, hey guys, what are we talking about today? What's going on? Do it that way. Don't say, I can't believe I just heard you say that. Just break up the conversation. And then what you want to do is, if the conversation is continuing, shut it down, right? Shut it down as soon and as quickly as you can. But the other thing you want to do is, if you believe someone is being bullied, whether you witnessed it, you heard it, don't just enter the conversation, but after it's broken up and it's over, go back to that person's workspace, their office, whatever, and just ensure that they're okay, that, do they need some support? Because this might not be the first time this took place, either with that individual or someone else. They may not be sure how to handle it, where to go. So by you doing that, you're standing up for not only for that individual, but you're standing up for people with disabilities. So next slide, I want to talk about the confidant. This is important. If someone talks to you and confides in you about an experience, and they say, I went to HR, and, Jeannie really didn't respond to me well at all. And what you don't want to do is respond by saying, are you sure? I've known Jeannie forever. I've never experienced that with her. I can't believe she would do that. You know Jeannie from your experiences. You don't know that individual necessarily from these others. When a question comes in or an issue comes up and they describe an experience, what you don't want to do is say, oh, I had an experience just like that. That doesn't matter. You don't want to take away from theirs. And again, these are things that we hear from individuals with disabilities in the organizations that happen to them all the time. They'll say something that relates to disability, and the person will jump in, and they're doing it for the right reasons. They want to relate, but it ends up coming out inappropriate. If you're a manager, hold regular office hours, encouraging your team members to come in and speak about issues that are troubling you no matter what it is. There's one organization that has been putting LGBT flags on the doors of managers, and the managers say, open hours, I'm open to this. Now they started putting disability signs and just saying, no matter what you're having as an issue, please feel free to come in and always talk to me on a personal level. Some companies are comfortable with that, some are not, but that's a way to encourage team members and folks to come in and talk with them. So if we go to the next slide, I think that what we have to remember is, obviously, depending if you're a corporation, you're an educational institution, a government agency, it is going to have an impact on everything we talked about. Depending on the geography you're in, especially if we're outside the U.S., big impact. Whatever your organization's overall approach is to diversity and inclusion, that is definitely going to sway what happens here and how this works. And it's also your organization's history of any regulatory issues that you may have had. So I say all this to say, if we go to the next slide, it's really about your organizational ecosystem. And what I mean by that, and I know this, so much of this work falls on you guys. I know that. You have to find a way to build an ecosystem so that there are leaders in other functions within the organization that see it just as much as an important part of their role as it is yours. And if they don't, that says something about the culture. So it goes back to, if we can bring the parts of the ecosystem together and come together culturally and saying this is who we are and what we need to be as an organization, you will be much more effective in all of this. And the next slide, just I put a little funny on there about the impact of COVID. Yeah, COVID has had a tremendous impact. We have individuals with disabilities who have said, this is amazing because now companies can see we can be effective to work from home. Others have said, my company thinks because of my disability, now that I'm home, I'm not working as hard or as much. We have individuals with disabilities that say, I'm really scared to go back to the workplace because I'm medically compromised. We have others that say, because of my disability, I feel so isolated, I can't go back to the work. I have to go back to the workplace. It's all of it. the only way this is going to work, COVID's not going away tomorrow, is if you go back and really create that ecosystem structure so you can look at this from all the different aspects of the organization and have a strategy that is a unified corporate strategy, but at the same time takes these individual issues into consideration as you go forward. So in the next slide, I say, you know, going forward, I've heard a lot of folks saying that we're going into a new normal or we have a new normal. I actually believe it's going to be a better normal. I think if we take some learnings from all of this, we're going to find we're much better positioned to address the needs, not just of people with disabilities, but across the board. But I do think that people with disabilities in particular are going to have a better normal. Like I said, mental health issues, they are being more mainstreamed as people are describing their needs. People with disabilities are showing that people can work very effectively and successfully from home. So I think it is a better normal, but as you all know as well as I do, it's something we really, really have to work at. So with that, I want to share with you that what we're going to do is, and Yvette, if you want to just pull the slide up of some of the offers, I made a commitment to Gail that for all of you putting, you know, 2 solid hours into spending time with us and working with us today, what I wanted to do is for some of those best practices that I mentioned, at least the ones that we can help you with, and certainly there's many things you all can do on your own. We'll email this out to you, but some of those best practices, what we're doing is as a group, we're offering anywhere from like 25 to 50% off services so that you can determine what, if anything, you need, whether it's participation from the business resource groups. We have what we call the Disability MBA, which is more coaching, the guidance tool. There's all different things, but I want to be able to help you in whatever way makes sense, and I don't want budget in as much as possible to stand in your way to do that. So don't worry about that now. I just wanted to mention it. We'll send you an email with some more information on that. Yvette, are you also going to be able to show the HRCI credit, or are we just emailing that out to everyone as well?
Nadine, this is Gail. I've been putting it in chat, so the program numbers I've been putting in chat. I put it a couple of times, and then when we close out the session, I'll put up the slide for about 2 minutes before we close out the program.
Okay, perfect. So what I want to do then with that is that if you'll go to my last slide, it's just really to thank everyone for taking 2 full hours, sharing this time with me, with Springboard, to talk about such important issues. And what I want to do is give us now some more time that if you have questions, topics that you want to go back and reflect on, let's go ahead and do that. I want to make sure we left enough time for that. So I will turn it back over to the ladies to see what kinds of questions came in.
More questions. This is Alicia.
We can't hear you again.
Sorry.
You're muffled again, Alicia. I'll take the first question while Alicia takes care of technology. Okay, so is it in the person with the disability's best interest to not disclose when going through a job interview, even if their disability would need accommodations? Or should the person wait until going through the hiring process?
All right, even at the end, you guys are going to ask tough questions. You know, again, it's such a personal decision. What I would say is this. Before someone goes in for a job interview, I do think that they should do their research about the company and get a sense of what the company stands for about disability, what it seems to do, how it embraces people with disabilities. Go on their website. I think if you have an opportunity to engage with someone, even on LinkedIn, who maybe has been public about having a disability and works at that organization, to help you make that personal decision. It also has to do with if you know in advance that there's going to be any kind of testing or that you're going to be interviewing in a historic building that may not be accessible. So all of those things have to really be checked out in advance. My personal feeling is that, and this is just for me, You probably get already today. I'm pretty open book. I like, I'll share anything about myself and my family. So that's my personal. But what I will say is this. Having witnessed just the situation with my own daughters and their experiences with disclosing, not disclosing, I do think that depending on the organization and depending on the culture and the approach of that organization, it can have a positive or a negative effect. And so there's really no right or wrong. I think it's more about what you feel in your heart and your head and what you think the right thing to do is. And I wish I had a better answer than that, but I really don't. Sorry.
Okay, so I have another one, Nadine. If an employee identifies as having a disability, but next year when the form goes out, he does not identify as having a disability, so should we remove the employee from the affirmative action data, having a disability?
That's a really good question. I actually, someone else asked me that the other day, and we actually reached out to a few folks, and no one had the answer on that. So I'll tell you what, my commitment is I'm going to make a few more calls on that, and I'm going to get back to you to provide that answer to everyone, because there's now been a group of 8 of us, and no one has had the exact answer.
So we have another one here. How would one approach the subject of needing a job coach, especially on the job to assist learning the job tasks?
So I guess it depends on a lot of factors. There are programs called, cohort hiring programs, where companies are hiring groups of individuals with disabilities to come in, and as part of that, a job coach is brought in at the start to help anyone who needs it. If we have an individual that's already employed at the organization, my recommendation is often before you go and ask for the job coach, it's to have a conversation, go into that interactive process, right, disclosure and interactive process, to really talk about, again, the essential job functions, which of those functions you're having challenges with, and to talk through, is it about an accommodation that I need, or is it about I need someone to really help me process through the job or the job requirements so that I can determine if I need an accommodation and what type. It really comes down to first having that interactive dialogue, because we have found there have been situations where folks have asked for job coaches, and at the end of the day it wasn't necessarily what was needed, and we've had folks ask for accommodations when actually it was more the job coach that was needed. And we do find that sometimes it has to do with the disability relative to what the job function actually is. So I'm not sure if there's a right or wrong. We find that that one is really, really independent of the individual situation, but it will require talking through the essential functions and what the need is before you can make that determination.
Okay. Alicia, do you want to ask?
I have another. Yes, I have plenty. We have lots of questions, Nadine. Lots of questions.
Okay, we're so good.
You mentioned earlier that if an employee requests an accommodation and you participate in the interactive process, that you can go into their record and mark their disclosure as disabled. If you do that, then the employee later notices it and questions why. What do you say? Do you change it back?
So if the person is requesting an accommodation, remember, they don't have to use the term disability, but they do have to describe, I need the accommodation in order to do X, right, whatever this job function is. So you have to have it documented as to, we're providing an accommodation to help with this particular job function, to be successful with this. That has to be documented no matter what. The person has to understand that if we don't have that documentation, here's a great example. This was a few years ago. We had a situation where someone had a disability such that the issue had gotten quite bad for them physically for a period of time, and they were able to utilize a car service to get to work. And the manager approved it. And It was an accommodation, but really there was no documentation as to why. It was just we approved a car service. That manager left the company, new manager came in. This was now a little longer than it should have been. New manager came in, sees this as an expense, and says, I don't understand what's going on. Goes to HR. HR says, well, I don't know. He's had this driver for 3 years. There's no documentation as to what's going on or what it's for. The documentation has to be there.
Okay, thank you. Next question. If employers have a form to request and a reasonable accommodation, are they allowed to ask the employee to describe the medical condition requiring the accommodation?
So here's my feeling on this. It's not about the medical issue, right? It's about, it goes back to the essential functions of the job, right? So I don't have to tell you that I have cerebral palsy, but I have to be able to describe to you that I'm having challenges performing this because my arm can't, I'm in a situation that my arm can't move. So here's a perfect example. I mean, whether you've noticed or not, I have not moved this arm. I'm dealing with rotator cuff issues. So depending on if there was some kind of job function that I had to do, I don't have to really give you the whole description about the rotator cuff and all the things that are happening medically, but I do have to describe to you why I'm not able to perform this essential function.
That's a good answer to the next question. When an
Lisa, I can't hear you again. I'm sorry.
Okay, so I'll ask this question.
Sorry.
Where Alicia was, but I will start with this one here. So can you give some best practices for helping to tear down stigma of mental illness in the workplace? Lots of managers are afraid to hire, work with, promote somebody with a known mental disability or mental illness, sorry.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So at Springboard, we have a whole global mental health practice. And I would say, 60% of what we do is about reducing stigma. And what I will say, and here's again, I said about COVID, better normal. I think COVID is actually going to help us. I've actually seen it already in many companies, break down some of that stigma. Because what it's showing is that people are vulnerable. People are people, and they're vulnerable to things that happened around them and that impact them. We do have part of the issue with stigma is just society, right? So let's take a step back. If I were to tell you that I recently experienced a heart attack or I'm having heart issues, you would say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, and you'd have a conversation. If I shared with you that I recently had a nervous breakdown, you would run for the hills. You wouldn't know what to say or how to say it. If someone goes into a hospital significantly depressed and even suicidal, they will put them if they admit them, they'll actually put them in a room with someone who is bipolar schizophrenic. Very, very different. As a society, we do not have an understanding of mental health. And so what happens is, if our healthcare system doesn't understand how to deal with it, how can we really expect our employers in a workplace to do that? So it's really talking through and mainstreaming mental health and talking about what are the different aspects, right? Someone can have a mental health situation as a result of a death of a spouse, and once a week, every year on that anniversary, they are going to feel depressed. That's going to happen. We have to talk about what that looks like and what that means. If someone, their spouse recently lost their job and they're the primary breadwinner and we're going through a financial crisis, they have to understand that. There's issues if someone has a dependent that suddenly is disabled. So the way you reduce stigma is really goes back to, in many ways, that disability etiquette and awareness. We have to bring this to a very real level, very practical level, and give managers the tools. They're not medical professionals. We have to give them the tools how to engage comfortably, not to do so in an adversarial manner, not to assume that if someone shared that they have a mental health situation that they are going to be violent. The media portrays people with mental health situations as being violent and having vulgar language. That's the exception to the rule. So we have to work at educating. And it goes back to even what we were talking about earlier of the allyship and becoming allies for individuals that have mental health experiences and how to speak up for them and on behalf of them.
Nadine, this is Alicia. I have another question.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes.
Is that better?
Yeah?
Okay. In a lot of recent DIB training, I learned that many people may feel inappropriately spotlighted or assumed as incapable when a colleague speaks up for them without being asked. A don't speak for me model. Can you comment on this?
Yeah. So the idea is not to speak for someone, right? So speaking for someone is saying, well, what Nadine meant to say was, or I think what Nadine's trying to convey. That's speaking for them. Or I think that you all should listen to Nadine, right? That's not what you want to do, because that puts the spotlight. It's more about saying, you guys always call on me to speak at this event. There's at least 3 other people here that I think have amazing skills and have shown me that they should do this. So Alicia, I've heard you speak recently. It's mainstreaming it, so I'm not just calling out one individual in that meeting environment. When it's on an individual basis, when I mentioned earlier about like going to your network and making individual introductions, that's no different than if you're doing that for a high potential woman, right? I believe in this individual, not because they're a woman or because they have a disability, but because they have the skill sets. I want to call them out to this individual, but that's not being done in a room of 20 people.
Mm-hmm. I have another. This is a great one, and you've spoke to this, but I think it bears asking again.
Okay.
Any ideas on how to elevate disability as equally important as other inclusion efforts?
Yes. So, it's interesting. We have an event on October 27th called Disability Connect. It's a day of intersectionality, and it brings together LGBTQ, disability, and veterans. Once a year we do this. And it's to learn from one another, appreciate each other's issues and needs, and realize that when we come together, we really learn about each one is just as important, and when we come together, 1 + 1 can make 3. Mm-hmm. And this year we're also injecting race, the pandemic, and politics. Because what it does illustrate is that no matter what someone's affiliation is, it could be religion, it could be ability, gender, it doesn't matter. We are people first. We hear in the disability community all the time, right? Person first language. It's about people first and understanding that we all bring something different. Different does not mean less than. Disability does not mean less than. And what we find is when we talk about the unconscious bias piece, people are coming to it with these biases about one or more of these groups. Having employee resource groups, I have mixed feelings about it, right? Because they're fabulous for all the reasons we know. But the challenge is, in some respects, it pits one group against each other for budget, for importance, and we forget that so many of us are more than one thing. Mm-hmm. So we have to have more of these intersectionality dialogues, and I think that will start changing some of that mindset.
Good point. Good point. We're at 2:28. We'll take.
Oh my goodness!
One more question, if that's okay with you, Nadine.
Absolutely. And then I'm also going to ask Yvette before we close out to just put up our last slide after this, so that we'll put our contact information and phone number. So if there are questions we couldn't answer for you, you want to get in touch, you can certainly do that. So go ahead. Last question.
Okay. Last question. When an employee requests another position for an accommodation based on their disability or their inability to perform the basic functions of their current role, what is the responsibility, or what responsibility does the company have as to what type of jobs or a best fit? How do they transition or start the process to start looking at a different position for the employee?
Wow, I don't think we have time for that one. There's a lot of pieces to that. So, think about just one thing I'll leave everyone with. Remember under USERRA, if we're talking about veterans and our service-disabled veterans, there's an obligation to provide training, to develop skills for another role. when we're talking about disability, that's not necessarily always the case. So we do find that it comes down to the employer, again, going back to employers' culture, their policies, their practices. And I will just give you an example. We have a big global technology client where this came up 2 or 3 months ago. And the Chief Diversity Officer contacted me and just said, I just want to gauge, here's what we're thinking, but I just want to gauge if this makes sense, if we can do this. And the position was this. I actually don't think, Nadine, we're obligated to really send this person for some extra training or to a class or whatever, but this is an amazing individual. They've worked for us for 5 years. They've been invaluable. I can only imagine if we give them more training, they'll provide even more value to the company. I just feel like even though we don't have to, why wouldn't we do this? And I was like a proud mama, right? I was smiling from ear to ear. And then following that, he said, I feel like this is something we really need to reevaluate and maybe put into our standard practices for what we do when this issue comes up. And that's the best answer I can give you. That's amazing. That's what we want to get to.
Excellent. Thank you, Nadine.
Oh, you're very welcome. So Yvette, can you put that, do you have that slide just in case folks want to ask more questions that we didn't have time for? I don't know if you have that. I certainly want to just, thank Gail and Alicia and just everybody who was on this call. 2 hours is a lot to take out of your day. I hope you found it helpful. I hope everything that we shared made sense. And I really look forward to seeing you at future ILG events. And I wish everyone the best of health and success going forward. Stay away from COVID. And we will look forward to seeing you all again soon. I will turn it back to Gail and to see if there's anything else you want to add.
No, I'm with you, Nadine. This is amazing. You are just amazing. I know
Thank you.
On behalf of all of the 19 or 20 ILGs that are participating in this event, I really hope that everyone enjoyed it. We would love to hear some feedback. Maybe this is something we can partner and do in the future again, specifically to honor such an important month when it comes to National Disability Employment Month. So thank you, Nadine. Anything you have to add, Alicia?
No, I'd also like to say thank you. Gail and I just started with an idea. We started talking about this back in, I think, the August time frame, and you helped to bring this to fruition and did an awesome job. Thank you again.
Thank you all. Wish you all the best. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.